Okay, so now we're going to talk about Part 9 of the Act, which is the rent regulation section. So we'll first talk about rent increases. A landlord must give all new tenants a notice to new tenant form, which is the Form 2. It's in your packet. It's this blue form. Very, very, very important upon first entering into a tenancy agreement. And if you have a current tenant that's there, you must give them 3 months written notice of any rent increase, which is the yellow form, and it is Form 1A. You must send all copies of the notice of rent increase and the notice to new tenant forms to the branch. So if you're using the forms that are provided by the branch, they're actually in triplicate. One goes to the tenant, one goes to the branch, and one's for your records. These forms are also available online, but of course if you're using the online ones, then you're going to be printing off your 3 copies. You can also actually send these, you can fill them in online and send an electronic version to the branch, but you're going to be printing off copies for yourself and for the tenant. If you are going to increase the rent above the guideline, you must apply to the branch to do that, and you can only have 1 increase in any 12-month period. So a notice of rent increase must be in writing. You can't give a tenant a verbal notice of rent increase. It's required to be in writing. It must show how much the rent is now, and when you're using our forms, the rent now, you're going to be filling in the present rent. You're going to be showing what the rent's going up to, which is the proposed rent, and you need to show it either as the percentage or the dollar amount. Actually, you have to show both. Give the date that the increase starts. Explain that the increase is not legal unless the tenant gets 3 months notice. Now this is all spelt out on our form, so if you use the prescribed form, all of the requirements are on there. You need to show the annual rent increase guideline. So for example, 2012 is 1%, 2013 has been announced at 1%. And you also have to say that the tenant has the right to disagree with the amount of a rent increase. And again, that's provided on this form. You can do your own form, but they need to have all of this information. So it's just easier for you as the landlord to use the prescribed form, and you don't have to make up your own and you know, not miss something that's important. The landlord must give the Residential Tenancies branch a copy of the written notice of the increase within 14 days after telling the tenant. And if the tenant disagrees with the amount of the rent increase, they have to provide the branch with a letter explaining why, and they must do that at least 60 days before the increase is to take effect. So, rent increases for new tenants. You can increase the rent on a rental unit only once in a 12-month period, but there are some exceptions. When a tenant moves into a rental complex with 3 units or less, so we're talking triplex, duplex, single family home, every time a new tenant moves in to the rental unit, the landlord has the right to reset the rent. But you can only reset the rent if you give the tenant a notice to new tenant form that shows what the previous rent was and the new rent that you're setting it to. If you don't give the tenant the notice to new tenant form and send a copy to the branch, that reset of the rent may not be allowed. If a complex has 4 or more units and you're increasing on a new tenant, if the tenant is moving into a 2-bedroom unit and you have 10 other 2-bedroom units in the complex, you can take the average of those 10 2-bedroom units and bring that one up to the average of, again, only if you use the notice to new tenant form, and only if you fill in the section that says that the rent has been increased because of a Section 132 rent average adjustment. When a tenant moves in, you must give the tenant the notice to new tenant form even if you're not planning an increase. So this form is required each and every time a new tenant moves into your unit. On this form, you're indicating what services are included in the rent. This form has to be given to them every time. If you don't give the tenant the notice to new tenant form and you've reset the rent on 3 units or less or done an average, if this form's not given to the tenant, the branch won't allow the increase. So if you want to apply for an increase that's above the annual guideline, you need to fill out an application and show that the guideline does not cover your costs. So the branch follows the Act and its regulations when reviewing an application and setting the rent. And there's basically 3 components that are included in an application. It's the increase or decrease in operating expenses, your property tax, your utilities, general repair and maintenance, your insurance, your basic operating expenses. So it's the increase or decrease between 2 consecutive 12-month periods. The second component is the capital expenditures, and these amounts are they're regulated amounts. They're in the legislation. So it is the allowable portion of capital expenditures, and it's 1/3, 1/4, 1/6, or 1/8, depending on what the item is, and it's again in Rent Regulation 9.1. Deferred maintenance, when repair and maintenance costs appear to have increased because of lack of proper or adequate maintenance in previous years. So if the property's been left unmaintained for years and all of a sudden you've done a bunch of repairs to bring it up to the standard that it should have been kept all along, that would be considered deferred maintenance. That's looked at. Any changes in the services the landlord provides. So if the utilities or the hydro was provided in the service and it's no longer going to be, that could also be considered as a component of your rent increase. And a landlord's deficit, if there is any. Also the economic adjustment factor, which is again announced by the government, and it's 0.5% of the revenue for this year. And any written comments or objections from tenants about the information on the application. Tenants must be given at least 3 months written notice of the rent increase. Again, you're going to use the Form 1A, which is the yellow one. You must provide the branch with the application at least 2.5 months before the date of the first increase. So we've provided an example here. If you give notice to the tenant on June 15th that you plan to increase the rent on October 1st, the branch must receive the application on or before July 14th. Of course, if July 14th is a Saturday or a Sunday, then it would be the following Monday that it would be required to be sent to us. The branch charges a $150 fee for complexes that have 19 units or less. And there's a $500 fee for the application for complexes with 20 or more units. And the fee must be received at the time the application is received at the branch. So now we're going to talk a little bit about unauthorized rent increases. The branch reviews all the notices of rent increases that are filed to make sure that the tenants have not been charged more than the allowable. We'll also review rent information if someone has a complaint or question about a rent the landlord is charging. And we call this review rent compliance. Examples of the most common rent compliance situations is if the landlord doesn't give the tenant 3 months written notice of the rent increase. If the landlord increases the rent by more than the annual rent increase guideline without applying to the branch. If a landlord withdraws or reduces a service that's included in a tenant's rent without applying to the branch. So again, this is if utilities are included and the landlord tells the tenant that I'm no longer going to be including utilities, you're required to pay for them yourself. If they don't apply to the branch to do that, then that would be considered a rent compliance issue. If a landlord increases the rent before the anniversary date, so if the last time the rent increase was March, and you increase it February the next year, it's less than 12 months. Things that the branch considers when it reviews the rent is the information that we have in registry, which is provided by when you send in your notices. We'll talk to current or previous tenants. Information that we receive from the landlord. So if we do have a complaint from a tenant or request to look into the rent, of course we'll contact you and ask you to provide your information, and that's part of what's considered. We'll look at the maximum allowable rent during that period. So if we're looking at a 5-year period that we're doing a review, we're going to consider the guideline amounts for all those 5 years. We're going to consider the rent that you actually collected during that time. The amount, if any, the landlord must refund to the current tenant or previous tenant. So if we determine that there was an overcharge, then of course you'd be required to refund the tenant. And how you have to refund the tenant. So you'd have, of course, the option to, if you have a current tenant that's living there now, they can offset their rent. Previous tenant, you can pay them outright. However it is you plan to repay your tenant, we'll look at that. If we determine that there's been an unauthorized rent increase, then we'll roll the rent back and we'll order you to repay the unauthorized rent to the current or previous tenants. So now we'll talk about rent status reports. These are really important. If you're considering selling your rental property, you should apply to the branch for a rent status report. And this report will let you know if there's any outstanding issues. So if we've got an outstanding repair issue or an outstanding security deposit issue, if your rents are all registered, it could be that you've sent the forms in and we seem to be missing some information. You want all of that looked after prior to selling your building. If you're thinking about purchasing a rental property, you should also request the rent status report, because as a landlord, a new owner purchasing a property, you're actually responsible for 2 years prior to purchase of that property if it's found that there have been unauthorized rent increases. So you may have to end up paying a tenant back 2 years prior to you even taking over. So this will protect you from that. You'll know if their rents are registered and if there's issues with the rents. There's an application available at the branch for this. Again, it's online, or we can send it to you, or you can come and pick it up. There's a fee of $150 for a complex with 4 or fewer rental units, and a $300 fee for the complex with 5 or more. And if you're the purchaser, signed authorization from the registered owner is required before we can release the rent status to you. So we'll talk about rehabilitation schemes. This is information about a full complex rehabilitation scheme. So if you plan to make major improvements to your residential complex, you can apply to the branch for a temporary exemption from the annual rent increase guideline. You have to apply for approval of the plan before you incur 20% of the total cost of the project. And within 14 days of applying for approval of the rehab scheme, you have to give your tenants affected by the scheme notice of your plans. So to qualify for a rehabilitation scheme, your plans must provide for major improvements to 2 or more of the following. You would have to do improvements to structure, electrical wiring, plumbing, heating, insulation, and thermal efficiency. If the tenants move out to allow you to do the work, you have to give them written notice to end the tenancy. Again, if they're in a fixed term agreement, you're giving them 5 months notice prior to the end of their term. If they're month to month, still 5 months notice, but 5 months from that day you give notice. Because the vacancy rate is what it is right now, the 5 months is required. And this is a situation, again, where if you give the tenant notice to move for renovations, the reasonable moving costs up to $500 that we covered before. Tenants who live in the complex have the right to move back in. They have to be given the first chance to move back in. And you must charge the returning tenant the lowest rent you would charge any other tenant for the same unit. So an example of this would be, you've done the rehab scheme, you've gotten your final order from the branch, everything's approved, you're exempt, and you get to reset the rent when this tenant moves in. So you're offering the previous tenant right of first refusal because they've asked for that in writing, and you tell them that you have the ability to move back into this unit now at the cost of $1,000 because that's what you've set the rent at. If the tenant decides, I can't afford the $1,000, so I'm not going to take it, you have to be able to rent that unit for $1,000 to somebody else. If you've advertised that unit for $1,000 and you're unable to rent it and you drop the price to $900, you have to go back to the previous tenant and you say, okay, the price is $900. You have the right of first refusal to rent it at $900. If they still don't want it, you advertise and you can rent it at $900, then the right of first refusal has ended. Does that make sense? So if your plan is approved, your complex can be exempt from the annual rent increase guideline for up to 5 years. You're still required to give the tenants 3 months' notice of any rent increase during that 5 years. And you're also required to give the notice to new tenant form to any tenants moving into the building. So those requirements don't change. The exemption is for the actual annual guideline amount. So the exemption period depends on how much the landlord spends for each unit. So if you spend between $9,000 and $11,999.99, you're exempt for 2 years. Right up until if you spend $17,000 or more, you're exempt for 5. So that's the breakdown of what the exemptions are based on the amount that you're spending for each unit. There's a cost for this application. The application cost is $500 plus $5 for each rental unit up to a maximum of $1,000. So you're not only paying the $5 fee, but you're paying $5 for each unit that's involved in this rehab scheme. And we have to receive the application and the fee before 20% of the work's been completed. There's also a unit-by-unit rehab scheme. So if you don't want to rehab your whole complex, but you want to just renovate one unit, you have to have the tenant has to have voluntarily vacated the rental unit. So you can't apply for a unit-by-unit rehab scheme if you've terminated the tenant for any reason. The tenant has to tell you that they're ending the tenancy voluntarily. So you're looking at if the end of the lease is over and they're not renewing, that's a voluntary vacate. Or if they've asked you to get out of their lease early and you're agreeing, that's all done in writing, that's a voluntary vacate. Yeah, I guess I covered that. So you can't entice or offer money or incentive to a tenant to move to get vacant possession in order to complete a unit-by-unit rehab. They have to have wanted that themselves. And you must not complete more than 20% of the proposed rehabilitation scheme for a specific unit before the first order approving the scheme is made. Application for a rehabilitation scheme for the specific unit. This type of rehab must include improvements in 3 of the following areas. So we're looking at kitchen cabinets, kitchen countertops, appliances, bathroom fixtures, flooring, electrical wiring, or other improvements such as the furnace replacement, central air. The branch will inspect the rental unit after the specific unit rehab application is received. So we're going to go, once we receive the application, we're going to go look at the unit first to determine if your application meets what we're looking for. We will inspect the whole complex if it's not been done in the last 5 years. So you need to know that the complex needs to be in good condition, or we won't allow the unit-by-unit rehabilitation scheme. When the branch sends out the initial order, it will include the work included in the application and any items found as a result of the inspection. So you may apply for the unit-by-unit rehab and list some items. When the inspector goes out, if they notice other items that need to be done, those will become part of the application. We also look to make sure that there's no other open files. So you have to make sure that all compliance files, enforcement files, and repair files have been resolved before the final order on the specific unit rehab scheme. So you have to make sure your rents are registered and all those things, and there's no outstanding compliance issues. The specific unit rehab scheme application must come with a tenant's written notice of termination. So there's your written voluntary vacate notice by the tenant. A copy of your written correspondence confirming a tenant's oral notice of termination. So if instead of them giving you written notice, they tell you in writing, you're going to confirm, or they tell you verbally, sorry, you're going to confirm in writing to them. If a tenant didn't sign a tenancy renewal, evidence that the renewal was offered, so you would show us the renewal that you gave the tenant and that it hasn't been signed by the tenant. And a copy, if the tenant abandons the rental unit, we want to see a copy of the abandonment notice that was posted on the rental unit. The exemption period for unit-specific rehab is determined by calculating the total of your expenditures during the expenditures relating to that scheme. So if the cost per unit is between $3,500 and $4,999.99, you get a 1-year exemption. If you have spent $5,000 or more on that unit, the exemption is 2 years. So when an order is made approving the scheme, you can't apply for a similar rehab scheme on the same unit for 5 years from the date the period of the exemption ends. So if you have a 2-year exemption on that unit, when that ends, we won't allow you to do another rehab scheme on that unit for at least another 5 years or more. There's a cost for this as well. The cost is $100 to file for a unit-by-unit rehab scheme, and the fee must be included with the application. So that's just a brief overview of rent regulation. I know there's going to be lots of questions, so we'll just open it up for questions. Unless you have something.
Yeah, I do. There's a couple of things again to just maybe clarify and stress. If any of you are doing a building rehab and it's your first time and it's multifamily, make note that the RTB is going to approve a rent increase after all the units are complete. So you can't go unit by unit at that time. If for whatever reason, you can fill the units, but it has to be at the old rents. And you then have a contract where you say that, you estimate that it might take 3 months to complete while the first tenant's already in your unit, in your newly renovated unit. You can say that in 3 months your rent will go up to such an amount pending approval. So that's a thing to note. Also note that the new bylaw, city bylaw codes will be applied to the new rehabilitated units, which a lot of times, I know in the beginning when I was doing them, I wasn't considering, and then by the time the fire department and the city bylaw inspectors and everything go through, you need to put firewalls, this, that, or whatever, all of a sudden that increases your budget amount that you didn't anticipate. So be aware of it and know the codes. Maybe just a quick clarification on the exemption as far as what rent is set after the exemption period is up. So whether it be 1 year to up to 5 years, at the end, I believe they're set at the highest rent
that you
were able to achieve in that last year. So be cognizant of that.
I guess just to expand on that a little bit, if you had sent the rent, let's say at $1,500, but you were discounting the tenant $300, the rent that you actually were able to collect was $1,200, and that would be what the rent would be set at. That would be what it was when it comes out of exemption.
Right, and the last thing would be just to a voluntary vacate. So if somebody does not pay the rent, is that considered? No,
because you're terminating a tenant for non-payment of rent. So if you actually issue a tenant a termination notice for any reason, that's not a voluntary vacate. The tenant has to be wanting out of the unit, either abandon the unit, not sign a renewal, or ask to be released from their lease early.
Thank you.